Hello, everyone. I am Patty Webb, Marketing Manager for Stylus Publishing. Welcome to our Using Reflection to Advance Assessment for Student Success author webinar. This is the first of our two-part webinar on the new title, Advancing Assessment for Student Success, Supporting Learning by Creating Connections Across Assessment, Teaching, Curriculum, and Co-Curriculum in collaboration with our colleagues and our students. Stylus webinars bring you direct access to our authors and their latest titles. Today, I'm happy to introduce our first two authors, Daniel Shapiro and Swarup. Dan currently serves as the Interim Associate Vice President for Academic Programs and Dean of University College and Graduate Studies at California State University, Monterey Bay. He has worked at CSUMB since 1997, beginning as a lecturer and as a faculty associate in the Center for Teaching, Learning, and Assessment. He started serving as director of TLA in 2014. Swarup is professor of chemistry and currently serves as interim director of general education and coordinator for the first year seminar at California State University, Monterey Bay. He co-authored the book Developing Outcomes-Based Assessment for Learner-Centered Education, a faculty introduction with Amy Driscoll, also published by Stylus in 2007. So welcome everyone, and welcome today, Dan and Swarup.
Morning, everyone. Welcome. Really lovely to be here. I'll just say that Dan and I started out at CSUMB both as lecturers 24 years ago and have been friends and colleagues ever since. And I'll say that as Amy rounded us up with Nelson to write this book has really been a joyful process. And the things that Dan and I will share with you today have been some of the most gratifying to learn together over this period of time. All right. So our time with you today focuses on using reflective practices to get more out of your investments in assessment. Dan will talk more about this later, but we find these practices hugely helpful in shifting the assessment lens from focusing on psychometrically valid data to focusing on collective meaning making in ways that build community and facilitate improvement in learning, teaching, and assessment practices. A big theme for today is using reflection as a collective meaning-making practice. We'll shift, and that's really embedded throughout all of our thinking today. We'll unpack reflection and then give examples of how to use it with students and faculty. And then we'll have time for your insights and questions. Integration. You know, one of my big lessons in this work, all the time I've been involved in it, is how much work it takes to really do the integration piece really well. And it's way more easy to assume that it's happening than to actually make it happen. And so you'll have to be super intentional about how to integrate these together. There's a large part of a chapter devoted to this in the book. The other thing that has been a repeated lesson throughout is that this work has the potential to be extraordinarily rich. You know, in all of our work lives, it's the relationships that really make it wonderful. And this work has real enormous opportunity to build relationships and in this shared meaning making. So we'll just give you an axiom, and that is to make things challenging, low risk, and social is a great recipe for having fun. And we'll encourage you to do that. A really lovely quote from a super useful article, and we kind of grabbed this as a theme for today, that the reflective practices we'll talk about today really are wonderful means of collective meaning making, and that turns out to be a super important part of our assessment work, and that without it really lacks fulfillment of its potential. So, you know, it's many of us haven't really learned to kind of engage our craft from a neurological perspective. And if you haven't ever read The Art of Changing the Brain, I really strongly encourage you to. It's another Stylus book and a wonderful book. But so if you think about reflection from a neurological perspective, really considering how incoming experience, that's what you're having now, interacts with past experience that's held in memory. And so it's interacting, all the people on the call, it's interacting with our unique pasts, right? It's engaging you differently, it's engaging you emotionally differently. Um, and so one of the things that Dan and I would really like you to and encourage you to do is really consider your purpose in using your reflection, excuse me. Um, so is our purpose to have your students or faculty use and apply frameworks that they already know. So, and use those frameworks to analyze, interrogate, evaluate their experience. And doing that tends to shift, focus the group in a single direction. It's not, the work's not identical, but it's very directional. And then, do we really want to engage the people that we're with as individuals? So to use free association and a quiet mind to see what emerges, a very different practice. And we'll differentiate between those two, directed versus emergent reflective practices. All right, and so next, Dan's going to unpack reflection in a different way by distinguishing different phases of reflection and highlighting attitudes that will help make reflection productive.
All right, thank you so much, Swarup. And I want to reiterate what Swarup said. This kind of getting with Nelson, Swarup, and Amy and writing this book has just been a really joyful process that we learned so much from, and we're very excited to be sharing some of our insights and what we came up with through writing this book, to share those insights with you. And again, to reiterate what kind of has emerged as the primary theme of this webinar, as Swarup and I are putting it together, is we're really talking about using reflection to foster collective meaning making that ultimately results in improved student learning. And so we want to spend a little bit of time here now really kind of unpacking what reflection is, because that's key to kind of being able to use it effectively. And reflection is a powerful tool that's often not given enough attention. Or when it is, it's often thought of something that just happens organically and not something that can benefit from thoughtful advanced planning. But reflection is a lot richer than that. And when we were working on the chapter of reflection for this book, we came across a paper by Carol Rogers, published in Teaching College Record, that unpacks reflection in ways that we found very helpful and relevant to assessment. Rogers distinguishes phases of reflection as well as attitudes. Those engaging in reflection really need to have if we really want reflection to foster collective meaning making and improve student learning. So to help you understand these phases and attitudes, I want you all right now to kind of think back to a specific assessment experience you have had with your colleagues. Occur during any part of the assessment cycle. And that can be anything from conversations you had when maybe writing or revising learning outcomes, designing assessments or assignments, work that you've done with colleagues scoring student work, or analyzing and presenting assessment data, or discussions about what actions need to be taken in response to assessment results, or even evaluating the effectiveness of such actions. Try to put your mind back into one of those conversations, a specific conversation of something you experienced during any part of the assessment cycle. Does everyone have one? Okay, so now with your mind in that place, in that memory, as Swarup was referring to earlier, I want you to think about these phases and attitudes as I read them, and just think about how they might apply to that context. And I'm just going to say the words. I'm not going to elaborate. Experience. Interpreting the experience. Naming the problem or question. Generating possible explanations. Creating hypotheses. Testing and acting. And one thing Rogers really highlights when she talks about reflection is the importance of the acting piece. that we really want reflection to culminate in action if we want that reflection to be productive. Okay, now I'm going to go through the attitudes. And again, think about your attitude during those conversations and activities that you're thinking about. And as I read each of these, ask yourself, did I have this attitude? Did others have this attitude? How did the presence or absence of this attitude impact the quality and effectiveness of that work? And so here are the attitudes. Wholeheartedness, which is enthusiasm about the topic. Directness, confidence and trust in one's experience. Open-mindedness, willingness to explore alternative ways of thinking. Responsibility, believing reflection should culminate in action. Curiosity, the desire to understand things that trouble or baffle us. And finally, desire for growth, openness to changing what we think and what we do. So the idea I want to highlight here is that if you're mindful about these different phases of reflection, and those participating in reflection have these attitudes that Rogers identifies, a reflection more likely lead to collective meaning making and effective action. And so we want to kind of start by kind of unpacking the reflection, really kind of get you to think more deeply about it. And so you can use it more intentionally in your assessment work. Now, ideally, reflection seeds conversations. And assessment leaders have been drawing more and more attention to the importance of conversations and having those conversations interspersed throughout the assessment cycle. And again, coming back to important goals of our webinar, those include highlighting the importance of these conversations, which are fostered through structured reflection, helping you see how these conversations are central to improving student learning, and that there are things that we can do as assessment practitioners to increase the effectiveness of those conversations and the likelihood assessment will lead to collective meaning making and improved student learning. I want to talk about a long-standing question in the assessment community, one that folks at all institutions should be asking themselves, and that is, what makes assessment data good? There's a nice paper by David Roscoe in Liberal Education titled Towards an Improvement Paradigm for Academic Quality. And in this paper, Roscoe explores this question about what constitutes good data. And Roscoe's opinion is that most assessment as commonly practiced across higher education does not actually result in good assessment data. But Roscoe also claims that the assessment paradigm has been successful in demanding that collective conversations about curriculum and instruction take place on a regular basis, and that this is the most important achievement of the assessment movement. Now, while I myself and others may disagree with Roscoe about what constitutes good data and whether what's happening across higher education is or isn't good data, I think it actually produces a lot of good data. That aside, I do wholeheartedly agree with Roscoe about the importance of making time for reflection and collective meaning making through conversation. And that is perhaps the most, agree with him, that is an incredibly important achievement of the assessment movement. And in our book, we write that no matter how valid or reliable data are, we will not improve student learning if we don't have conversations that connect what we learn from assessment to how we facilitate student learning. And Ku et al. In their book, Using Evidence of Student Learning to Improve Higher Education, make a very similar point when they talk about the different ways of thinking about what constitutes valid data. And they introduce the concept of consequential validity, which posits that the impacts or consequences of assessment data use should be factors in determining validity. And they go on to say that the fact that evidence meets the highest possible psychometric standards may have no bearing on its effectiveness in promoting action on campus. And vice versa. A locally designed student survey, for example, may not have the psychometric properties of a tool such as the NESI, but the process of designing it may start productive, generative conversations among faculty, and such conversations are often the harbingers of meaningful change. And that is all to say that when we do assessment, our reflections and conversations about those assessments may be much more important than the numbers presented in assessment results. However, making time for those conversations is just the beginning. If we want to maximize the likelihood that those conversations will lead to improved student learning, we need to be strategic about how and when those conversations happen. And in our book, we present a lot of examples of how our colleagues at many different institutions have weaved reflections throughout the assessment cycle for the purpose of fostering collective meaning making and motivating actions intended to improve student learning. But today we're going to highlight two specific examples that come from our work at California State University, Monterey Bay. First, Swarup is going to talk about integrating reflection into the development and improvement of learning outcome statements and how to use learning outcomes and reflection in the development and use of learning outcomes. And then I'll talk about how combining reflection with the assessment of student work helps us improve the alignment of outcomes, rubrics, and assignments. So with that, I'll turn it over to Swarup.
Thanks, Dan. Just thinking about, and I think when you look at this slide, you might be thinking, wow, do Swarup and Dan and Nelson and Amy actually have outcomes so central in their classrooms? And the answer is we do, and spend a lot of time and energy doing that for what we think are really good reasons. But so when we think of the larger purpose of outcomes, organizing principles for curriculum, for degree programs, and at the institutional level for institutions, and organizing principles for pedagogy and instruction, really aligning the kinds of performance we want from students with instruction that will garner that performance, allow for that performance. And then, of course, for assessment, one of the larger purposes for outcomes that's talked about repeatedly in the literature is it helps students direct their efforts. And I'll just point out that these first two assume that that institutions have achieved a common understanding of what the outcomes mean. And I'll just point out that, and I suspect many people on the call today have had the experience of, sitting with a group of faculty and talking about a learning outcome and realizing, oh, we don't share a common understanding of what this outcomes means. We're not using, we come from different backgrounds. Our use of language is different, and but if students are going to benefit from directing their efforts toward learning outcomes, then they'll have to share a common understanding of what an outcome means with the faculty. Otherwise, there are surprises in store. And so, and of course, a common understanding within faculty and across departments, at least for GE courses. So this is a great deal of work and really gratifying work and super important. And our big point today is that reflective practices serve these ends in terms of really making the connections. It's hard to imagine achieving that without engaging a lot of energy in the kinds of practices that we're talking about today. Let's see. So if we're the whole notion, right? Allowing students to direct their energies, again, assumes this understanding of the meaning of outcomes between students and faculty, and this means pulling outcomes out of the syllabus and figuring out how to engage students with them. And so here are some examples of how you might go about that on the first day of class. You might engage your students with the course learning outcomes, ask them what they mean. You could have students rank their current ability in on these outcomes and ask for evidence. You know, if you say you have this one mastered, what evidence would you share around that? So all sorts of really engaging, and it's easy to couple these kinds of practices with social practices that you want to engage your class with to build community. So a lot of potential here for that. Another great way of using outcomes with students, excuse me, next slide, please, Dan. Thanks. Is to work with students and outcomes to develop grading rubrics. I love doing this with students. It's such a great way to see into their thinking. And also to use students as leaders in the class. One of the things that I really think is important is that ultimately it's right, the people in front of us in our classrooms are the generation that will take over from us. And it's their thinking that will be important shortly rather than ours. And I brace my students with that. In terms of our practice, having students deconstruct an outcome into its components, what different components they see in a given outcome, have students define the terms. Frequently, faculty use terms and outcomes that aren't readily understood by students or that may challenge students. And it's important to that we have common understandings of the terms that we use. I really appreciate the conversations that I have with students around evaluation, really probing their thinking on, okay, in a given chemistry problem, some things, right, these are multifaceted word problems essentially, and some things are going to receive more points than others. Why? Do we assign more points to the subtle and more challenging things? Do we assign more points to I got distracted by the chat, I apologize. Do we assign more points to the more challenging things, fewer points to the more obvious things? Anyway, it is fascinating to hear students cogitate over these questions. And again, it's a really easy way to see into students' thinking and you can recognize what they know that's not so, right? Their misconceptions, and so you can nudge them and correct thinking there. It also really gives students agency. Like, wow, we're gonna be assigning, we're gonna develop a rubric by what you'll use to assign points. And again, most of us talk about really wanting to give students agency. This is a fabulous way to do it. All right, next slide, Dan. Okay, a little bit more about this idea of directed versus emergent reflection. And I'll just say that neurologically, these are really, really different tasks. Imagine a scenario you got in class and you have students sit quietly for 10 minutes reflecting and writing on all the things that come to mind as you consider the murder of George Floyd. There's an example of emergent reflection. And again, there's no real framework. You've given a setting, a context, but you're not driving their thinking. Very open-ended. And the kinds of things that are likely to arise from student writing on this, especially if you did it anonymously, would be their implicit frameworks that they bring. And a lot of those frameworks might be surfaced in class to good effect, not identifying students, right, you might use some frameworks as examples and others as non-examples. So that versus directed reflection, in which we reflect on the murder of George Floyd while considering different elements of critical race theory. Here, we're really focusing students' thinking through the frameworks involved in critical race theory. And here, student writing would reflect how much they embodied those frameworks or not, and give you insight into how much they knew about critical race theory. So again, examples of two different prompts with very different student work products emerging from those prompts. And again, neurologically, these are two very different tasks. When we set people frameworks, we narrow their focus, and that's one kind of very different kind of task. When we really want students or faculty to engage in a context in an open-ended way with a quiet mind and to see what emerges, that's that'll garner different things. All right, and here we've got an example, a different example looking at an assessment setting. So an example of emergent reflection working with faculty to develop learning outcomes. What do we want students to know and be able to do? This was the question that Amy confronted us with in 1999 and really set the stage for a great deal of learning, because most of us were scratching our heads. Well, we don't know, was my first response. But ultimately, those conversations surfaced a huge number of very different ideas, and those ultimately we crafted into workable learning outcomes. And again, the only things that are driving that conversation are the implicit frameworks that faculty brought in from their disciplines, but it's quite open-ended, quite inquiry-based. Whereas, sorry, Dan, not done yet. Thank you. Whereas directed reflection, an example of this would be using a rubric with a group of faculty in a norming session or to evaluate student work. It's a great example of directed reflection. The criteria narrow our vision and focus our attention. In addition to collecting data on student performance, these activities easily result in refining learning outcomes or refining the rubric. And right now, Dan, we're going to shift, and Dan's going to take you into some great examples of ways to engage faculty in assessment practices like this.
All right, thank you, Swarup. So what I'm going to do next is share an example of how at California State University, Monterey Bay, we've weaved reflection into the assessment of student work as part of our annual assessment of institution level learning goals. And those learning goals are, some of those were determined by WASC, our accrediting agency. So those of you who are in the WASC area will be very familiar with the 5 core competencies: critical thinking, information literacy, quantitative reasoning, written communication, and oral communication. And we were expected to do direct assessment of student work of these 5 core competencies. And so as we started thinking about how we wanted to do this, our goal, in addition to addressing this accreditation requirement, we didn't want to be doing anything because our accreditors told us we have to do it, right? And our accreditors were very clear in terms of, we don't want you doing anything that's not going to directly support student learning and student success, right? We don't want you doing things for us. We want you doing things that are going to help your students. So we put a lot of thought in terms of how are we going to do this in a way that would both engage faculty as well as motivate them to change how they facilitate student learning, or at least critically examine how they're facilitating student learning. And the assessment we put together involved what's becoming an increasingly common practice across higher education. We collected assignment guidelines and student work that align to our institutional learning goals from programs across the campus. We invited teams of faculty to assess student work using those institution level work rubrics. But in designing the assessment, we wanted to create a process that would really engage faculty in discussions about how to improve student achievement of learning outcomes. We were worried that if we got too focused on producing data that was, met high standards for validity and reliability, it would really, kill assessment, kill the joy that can come from assessment. And because we were new to this, we figured, let's prioritize faculty engagement. And so, we took that in mind in terms of designing the assessment, and reflection is going to play a very key role in this. But so, because this is our first time going through it, we knew we wouldn't have this perfectly reliable and valid data coming out of it. We figured we also wanted to generate some indirect data on what impacts assessment was having on faculty thinking and practice, because we saw that as very valuable. And so the way we tried to do this was by intentionally scheduling time for reflection and conversations into the assessment work, capturing the impacts of those reflections and conversations on faculty, and also to be able to share those impacts more broadly, both in our own institution and at other institutions. And so I'm going to go into more detail about how we did that. But if you're interested in finding more information about this, in addition to what the information we present in the book, I've provided a link on this slide that leads to a lot of information, the actual rubrics we used, and a lot of other background around how we did this work. Okay, so let me show you how we set up a day. And each institution level assessment project lasts about 3 to 5 days and involved about 8 faculty members from different programs across campus. And we intentionally structured the day so that it included time for both emergent reflection and direct reflection and conversation. And the way it worked is each day would start by reviewing reflections submitted by faculty at the end of the previous day. After reviewing those faculty reflections from the previous day, faculty would assess student work on their own, at the end of which they would engage in an emergent reflection activity, where we'd break after the assessment and we'd all get together for 30 minutes before lunch. And faculty would just ask basically, well, what happened? What did you experience? And we would just see kind of what kinds of ideas emerge. Those would often be useful for entering the second round of reflection, which would begin after lunch. And then at the end of the second round, we'd have another 30 minutes for more emergent reflection, just sharing experiences, what they learned. But finally, to help us really capture what was going on, we ended each day where faculty would respond in writing to 5 more directed reflection questions. And these questions were modeled after Stephen Brookfield's critical incident questions, CIQ, if those of you are familiar with that, which are really designed for students to understand their learning. And so for those of you that are not familiar with it already, those questions are, at what moment did you feel most engaged with what was happening? At what moment during the assessment were you most distracted from what was happening? What action that anyone took did you find most affirming or helpful? What action that anyone took did you find most puzzling or confusing? And what surprised you the most? And faculty, they just, we said, don't spend a lot of time on this. Just quickly answer these questions, and then we turn them loose. And as I said, these would then form, we'd look at these and we would use what they shared to open discussion the next day for the second day of assessment. But also what we did, since we have these in writing, is we had a faculty assessment lead for each of the 5 core competencies. And all of those leads got together, and what they did is they read through all these responses and coded them and looked for major themes that were emerging. And so we did that both, after this, as I said, there was like 7 different assessment projects over a 5-year period. So we looked at all these reflections from all those daily activities that came in. But also at the end of these 5 years of 7 different institution level assessment projects, we followed up with all the faculty and asked them, how did engaging this assessment work impact your teaching and your work with students? And so what I'm going to do next is I'm going to share some of those results. First, I'm going to share the results from what we learned from coding the reflections after each day of assessment. And then I'll share what we learned from looking at, going to faculty. Some of this is like 3 or 4 or 5 years after they did the work, asking them how it impacted them. So first with the daily reflections, here's some of the things we learned and some of the themes that we saw. We identified kind of 4 major themes. One was, and we identified a theme. We looked at the percentage of responses that had what we call affirmative responses, in terms of they had positive responses to the social interactions that occurred, the norming sessions that occurred with student work, the work with rubrics. And the rubrics fell into two different areas, kind of something you found helpful, but also something that you found most perplexing or confusing. And so just to read some of these, for social interactions, faculty wrote an example was of a affirmative response was, I enjoy collaborating with faculty. It allows for sharing teaching styles, insights, and strategies. It allows me to think more deeply about course and assignment design to benefit student learning. In respect to norming, as a faculty member wrote, we all operate within a certain set of standards. The norming process reminds us that we don't always share identical values. Deliberately applying a rubric can help to diminish those personal distinctions. With regards to rubrics, writing assignments and corresponding rubrics can be utilized as a powerful teaching tool. The assignments and feedback given to students across this university should be rigorous, clear, and consistent. And you can see tying back to the collective collective meaning making, right? Looking for that consistency. And then finally, in terms of puzzling or confusing, also with regard to rubrics, we're still fleshing out the rubric. So there's a little bit of confusion, but that's the kind of the point of this whole process. So, what we see in these responses is just a lot of that collective meaning making that's directed towards improving student learning. What kinds of actions did these reflections and this work culminate in? Well, one of the outcomes of this work is that faculty involved in the assessment process after it was done, decided that we needed to create assignment guides that would help faculty produce better assignments. Because a lot of times what we're finding is that we couldn't tell whether students were not meeting the outcome because they hadn't achieved the necessary learning, or because they simply weren't asked what they needed to do to demonstrate competency of the outcome. So we decided that assignment guides were really important to help faculty design assignments and work on their assignment prompts. And the second webinar in this series, the one that's happening next week with Nelson Graff and Amy Driscoll, they're going to go into a lot more depth in terms of how we've worked with faculty on improving assignments. Another thing is they revised the institution level rubrics to make them more effective and hopefully foster more consistency. And in addition, they created rubric guides that kind of unpack the terms and the concepts in the rubric, which have been incredibly helpful in calibrating and norming calibrating rubrics and norming assessment of student work, increasing consistency, again, fostering reflection and dialogue that results in collective meaning making. All right, let me go to the other one, basically reflecting after assessing student work. And here, faculty were asked how participation in these assessment projects affected. These were a little bit more focused. We asked specifically how it affected course and syllabus design, assignment design, teaching and other interactions with students, and work or other conversations with faculty and staff. And again, we got high percentage of the faculty that in the reflections referred specifically to these things. And some representative quotes include, I think more about the overall course rather than assignments first. That is, what do I want my students to get out of the course? For assignment design, not only did I change wording and assignments to more directly target the learning outcomes, I also dropped an assignment that did not directly address learning outcomes and added 2 other assignments to allow students to think more critically and use information literacy skills. With regard to teaching and other interactions with students, I was able to communicate oral and written communication goals in an informed, confident manner. I particularly appreciated that I was speaking from a platform that included my peers rather than being based only on my personal training and perception. And here we've got the collective meaning making here going again, just threaded throughout all this work. And then finally, work or other conversations with faculty and staff. I become more bold in pushing for greater clarity for my colleagues and their work with students, and for more opportunities for collaboration to achieve more parity in the work that we assign. So again, we were just thrilled to see all this. And again, we saw a high percentage of faculty that were providing this kind of feedback, and very consistent. Of course, if you're thinking about all this with a critical mind, you're also well aware that while we have provided indirect evidence that participating assessment can positively impact how faculty connect assessment to facilitating student learning, we really haven't provided any evidence that these reflections and conversations result in improved student learning. That's a glaring missing piece, which we acknowledge, and again, hope that all of you are going out and trying to do that work. We are too, but that is a piece that we all need to work on. Nevertheless, we feel the results such as these are very encouraging and suggest that creating space for reflection and conversation and being intentional about how those reflections and conversations are set up, that's essential for fostering a learning-centered assessment culture that engages faculty, and also with some creative planning, also students and staff. And our book goes into a lot of examples of how we can also engage not just faculty, but also students and staff in all of this. And so that when we lack evidence that these reflections and conversations directly improve student learning, emphasizing reflection and conversations as we have, it's clearly engaged faculty in ways that make it very easy to imagine that it could very well result in improved student learning. So with that, I want to turn it over to Swarup, who will kind of wrap things up, and then it looks like we'll have some time to address your questions and engage in some conversation.
And before you go on from this slide, can we stay here just for a moment?
Sure.
I just want to point out, most of us, many of us, as really engaged in our teaching, we develop intentionally recursive courses that loop back on themselves, right? So that we're not just plowing through in a linear way, but constantly referring back to what has come and incorporated the previous learning into what's going on now. In much the same way, Dan designed these assessment practices that you're looking at, and you can think of this as a recursive, if there's a parallel between a great course and a great assessment practice, here is a recursive practice in which, through these questions, we're getting faculty to loop back on what did we do, what did we learn from it. And one of the things that's so exciting to me in these quotes is that it's very clear that faculty are learning. We don't know if they're changing their practice, as Dan was saying, from that learning. But if we were seeing these kinds of comments in our, from student reflections, we'd be excited. And I think just in terms of a practice that engages and stimulates faculty learning, these have been really successful. And also, I'll just say, I know a lot of us and a lot of campuses associate assessment with challenge, with resentment, with added burden. And I just want to say, when you look at these quotations, that is not what these faculty are feeling. That's not the affect that these that these quotations produce. Their engagement, really pleased to be a part of things, really glad to be learning. So I'll just say that in addition to really helping faculty learn, in terms of developing positive energy for assessment on your campus, reflective practices have a lot to offer. All right, now we can go to the takeaways. All right, value, reflect. A big theme in this hour together, and we hope it's a great takeaway for you, the value that we find in it. Value, to sum it up, assessment coupled with reflective practices equals enormous opportunity. Be intentional. Like any research project, failure anticipate to results or to think deeply about what you want from this research will result in missed opportunities. So again, this is important planning. You'll have to start well in advance of your annual assessment work or your ongoing assessment work and think about how to build in these reflective practices. Connect, make it social. If you haven't discovered the magic of making your practices social, and now that the pandemic is waning, you could either gather people in person and feed them, always a bonus. But truly making it social, it will serve you hugely. Act, don't, learn from these practices and build them into your future work together. The importance of that can't be overstated. And what's more, returning faculty will really appreciate seeing what's been learned built into your ongoing practice. All right. Finally, time for some reflection on your part. We're really interested in what this has stimulated, what questions you might ask. Are there ways that you might use what you've learned today in your own future work? We'd love to hear them.
And just while people are thinking about, just sort of, there are a couple questions
Right.
that came up. Let's see, one of them was, while you're talking about outcomes, what class sizes are you working with? And secondary, post-secondary level?
Right. These were, I primarily teach first year college chemistry, at least in a previous life. And those class sizes were between 30 and 40. So I was privileged to not be working with hundreds of students at a time, but the practices that I talked about, developing rubrics with students around exam questions, was done with groups of between 30 and 40 and very powerful.
And also sort of, there's a question that came in through the question and answer panel, and I just pasted into the chat, so maybe you can see it. It says, for those of us whose programs or institutions do not require having outcomes stated in syllabi, do you think it is more important to train faculty to articulate the outcomes or to work with students to generate them? I would love to jump to the latter for more student focus, but I'm worried that faculty don't have the impetus or experience on outcomes in general and why they are so important to have them articulated.
That's a great multifaceted questions. We'll have to take it one chunk at a time. In terms of, developing outcomes with students is powerful. Again, it's a great way to give them agency and a great way to see into their thinking. Some of my most powerful experiences with students have been doing exactly that. But that was in a setting in which I had the latitude to do that, right? That I wasn't directed or bound by institutional learning outcomes in that setting. So I had students, I worked with students to develop a course outcomes and then wove the outcomes for the GE area in amongst those. I took responsibility for them, the students, and I developed the course learning outcomes together. And I'm suggesting a both and there. I think that's a great way to work that agenda. And I'm hoping that I got the pieces. Or Dan, do you want to jump in?
Well, there's another question that just came into the question and answer box, and that was, can you mention how this would be different for engaging first generation minority students?
I think my experience has been these kind of practices really do a great job at engaging first year in minority students, first generation and minority students now. These kinds of practices require rapport, so you'll have to do your rapport and trust building on the front end, and to make sure that their voices that they feel comfortable, safe, contributing to those conversations. Or you can do a combination of anonymous work with students, and so nobody's worried about looking stupid or you know, not having the language to appropriately talk about what's going on in class. But I think a combination of doing your rapport trust building work up front and then engaging in to include enough anonymous work that people develop a sense of safety, and it'll be really important for us in working with first gen minority students to make sure we're on top of our implicit biases, and to be looking at our own behavior for that, and to nip it. Dan, you got more?
Well, and then Nelson just pointed out that, you know, it's that worth mentioning that at Cal State Monterey Bay, we have a very high proportion of first generation minority students. So you've done this work with that student body.
Thanks, Nelson. Yes.
Okay, so here's another question that just came in from Helen. Can you talk more about the work of revising institutional rubrics, especially in Gen Ed? It seems like being able to do that is really important, but also potentially tricky, since a rubric may work perfectly well for assignments in one discipline while not aligning as well with assignments addressing the same outcome from another discipline or even another instructor.
Yeah, the politics around GE are fraught with tricky situations. It's a great insight and a tough experience to be having. In it, again, I'll just say engaging in, you know, assessment, and when people are venturing their opinions and experiences in public, there's perceived social risk by a lot of us in those kinds of situations. So people who are helping with this work will want to do that rapport building trust work on the front end. I mean, there's nothing inherently wrong with or nothing inherently invaluable about a rubric working in some settings better than another. And it might illustrate the need to everyone. Oh gosh, we need either a more flexible rubric or perhaps two rubrics, that the rubric that we're trying to apply in this setting doesn't work so well. And that's great to understand.
Right, and it also, you know, when we take the rubrics and work with faculty, we try to make it really clear that this is, you know, these aren't mandates in terms of what they have to do or how they have to structure their assignments. That we talk about them as being tools that faculty can use to make their assignments better, right? So the idea is that, and Nelson and Amy will get into this, their webinar next week. But with the way we talk about work with faculty and programs is, you know, these rubrics, these assignment guidelines that we made, these are tools that you can use to improve your assignments. But they're also things you should use in terms of being very deliberate about what you explicitly do or do not include in your assignment guidelines, right? Because sometimes you might want to be explicit and include something because you want to prompt students to, you know, do a particular, you know, demonstrate a particular form of learning. But sometimes you want students to demonstrate things without being prompted. So again, I think we do try to take care with using the institutional level rubrics that they're not mandates, they're tools that help faculty do things better, and that they're free to take or not take whatever they find useful. But what we do find is when you have faculty from different programs teaching the same GE area, doing this work together, that they start converging and kind of really developing that sense of shared understanding. And so anyhow, I don't know, I hope that addressed the question. And are there, I think we're getting close to time. Maybe if there's one last question, or if anybody wants to share something they've done at their institution, that would be, we'd love to hear what you're doing and where you work. And it looks like that'll pretty much wrap it up. Let me stop sharing my screen.
A pleasure to be here with you today. Thanks so much for coming.
Hi, everybody. Are we all back? There we go.
Yep,
Thank
there
you
we
to
go.
Dan Shapiro and Swarup for sharing their time and presenting this Using Reflection webinar opportunity. And thank you to everyone who turned in live with us this afternoon. If you're interested in pre-ordering Advancing Assessment for Student Success, use code AAST25 to get. Also, the royalties from the book will go directly to the CSUMB Student Emergency Fund. I will also share the link to the book in the chat bar. The book is set to publish on June 30th. I will also share that part 2 of this webinar series is next Thursday, June 10th. Join co-authors Amy Driscoll and Nelson Graff for Humanizing Assignments. That registration link will also be shared in the chat bar. The webinar video replay will be available tomorrow or Friday and shared on all of our Stylus social media feeds. And the webinar chat log will also be saved and emailed to everyone who has registered as well. If you have any feedback on this webinar or any questions for future webinars, please feel free to email us directly at stylusinfo@styluspub.com. Any last sentiments from Swarup and Dan? And then also Amy, who will be presenting next week.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you everyone for being here, and we really appreciated your time.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.